Hi, I'm Karlin Borisenko. In early 2020, I was the knitting Democrat who accidentally went viral on the internet for going to a Trump rally and then left the party. I became the conservative darling, was on all the shows, traveled around the country, and then realized that conservatives were no better than Democrats. If there's one thing that I've learned, it's that both political tribes are two sides of the same coin. But it wasn't all bad. On my journey, I became obsessed with understanding the woke ideology and the culture war. I broke the story of the city of Seattle doing segregated training with its employees.
How bad has this stuff become? The city of Seattle has now put out, I'm not kidding you, this is according to Dr. Karlin Borisenko, who's an organizational psychologist. The city of Seattle asked its white employees to voluntarily spend a day off in a training about their internalized racial superiority.
I broke the story that led to the first ever federal lawsuit against critical race theory in the schools. I broke the Coke Be Less White story, one of the biggest anti-woke stories of all time. It got over 30 million views. Coca-Cola's corporate headquarters even had to change their outgoing voicemail.
Throughout the past few days, you may have seen inaccurate reporting on the content of our recently launched diversity, equity, and inclusion training program.
I exposed the schools in Burlington, Vermont for grooming middle school children live on the internet. They called me an unwoke cult leader for that. And the Vermont Human Rights Commission slandered me publicly as being a hate channel. I even got called a hero in Breitbart for exposing that the Washington Post was writing a hit piece on Christopher Rufo. I have broken story after story after story about what's going on in the public schools, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to autistic sex education, to the Department of Education in Michigan, literally training teachers all over the state how to groom children. I wrote a book called Actively Unwoke, the ultimate guide for fighting back against the woke insanity in your life. I host a podcast all about fighting back, and I'm downloading all of my knowledge to you on my Substack, karlin.substack.com. The world is a crazy place. We are literally surrounded by cults on all sides. On this show, we're going to do a deep dive into all aspects of the culture war, and I will show you the dark, dystopian underbellies on both sides. Here are the commitments I'll make to you. I will always tell you the truth. I will always bring you receipts. And if you stick with me, I promise you will see the world differently. Welcome to the cult. Please mount that like button for me and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Well, hello, everyone. I hope everyone is having a great Wednesday. I actually had to think about that for a second. Welcome to the cult. The cult is where we talk about what is going on all sides of the culture wars. I'm not on anyone's team. I'm not on anyone's side. I mostly think everyone is stupid. And so I feel like I can come from a pretty detached perspective to hinge people back into reality with what is going on in the world. And today is going to be another day where I'm going to be dealing with the highly depressing topic of Von Cobra, it was a missed opportunity to not name it with the K, wasn't it? You're right about that. Well, we live in depressing times, folks. We live in a time when it has become clear to me that the idea of an anti-war right is a fiction. We live in a time where conservatives really believe that the noble and moral thing to do is to genocide an entire people. We live in a time where people are more concerned with outrage than they are in hinging into reality and actually understanding topics. And that is why we are covering the topic we are today. Now, yesterday we watched a video about just generally what the socialists. So for those who might be new to me, No, we will not be covering the Ben Shapiro Twitter beef with Andrew Tate, if for no other reason than Andrew Tate blocked me on Twitter for calling him a narcissistic psychopath a little while back, and I don't feel like logging into my SOC account to see what's going on because I don't change my I don't care that much. But what we do on the show, and what I spend a lot of time doing, is doing deep dives into the actual far left socialist activists, not the shit you see on libs of TikTok, because that's not real, not the outrage posts that you see on Twitter, because a lot of that stuff isn't real either. We watch a lot of far left socialist content on this channel. Now, of course, we do do the official Socialism Saturday stream on Saturdays at 6 p.m. And that is where we regularly watch socialist content. But sometimes it's useful to have midweek socialism as well. And that's what we've been doing, what we did yesterday, and it's what we're going to do today as well. Because I do think it is useful for us to hinge into reality about what the far left thinks in terms of Israel and Palestine, which we did yesterday, and especially hinging into reality about what the idea of decolonization means. Because right now, conservative Twitter is doing their level best to spin up a war. They're trying to get us to go to war. They are calling for the genocide of an entire people. And yeah, I am going to call it what it is. It's a genocide. When you're talking about the murder of over 1 million children by turning Gaza into a parking lot, that's not anti-war. It's not pro-life. And it's definitely not the moral and righteous thing to do. And one of the ways that conservative Twitter is trying to spin people up right now is not just that they're lying about things that have happened. And I'm not arguing, I have to repeat myself from yesterday. I'm not arguing that Hamas is good. Hamas is a terrorist organization. I'm not arguing that I'm on the side of Palestine. I'm not on anyone's side. I think both Israel and Palestine have behaved atrociously in this entire situation. I think there are really bad things that Israel has done to the Palestinians that have caused this situation in the first place. I think Hamas is a terrorist organization, and what they did to Israel on Saturday was atrocious. I am not on anyone's side. I am not on anyone's team. I am on the team of, I don't want the United States to go to war with Iran, which is quite frankly the team that everyone should be on. And I find it morally reprehensible that conservative Twitter is spreading lies and propaganda out of Israel to try to drag the United States into the war, which would inevitably end up with the United States in a war with Iran. Now, one of the things that conservative Twitter is doing to try to do this is they have suddenly discovered that BLM is a socialist organization that supports Palestine. It's like, ooh, poof. We didn't know that before. Well, we, of course, knew that before because people who watch my channel regularly, and especially my socialism streams, you guys are easily 2 years ahead of where the average conservative is in terms of their mindset. We knew that BLM was an organization that was going to be on the side of Palestine for any number of reasons, because they are, first of all, Jews to socialists represent capitalism. The number one enemy of the far left is capitalism, private property. So Jews are going to be a symbol of capitalism for the far left. That's why a lot of people on the far left are downright anti-Semitic. They do not like Jews at all. They've always been in Palestine's team. Palestine is, of course, going to be considered a group of oppressed people who had their land, and I'm giving the socialist perspective now, had their land taken away from them by Israel. Israel keeps encroaching on their land, keeps taking their land away from them. The idea of colonization is when an oppressive force, otherwise known as capitalism, comes in and takes land and makes it their private property. That's what colonization is. Decolonization is taking the private property back. That's a really simplified explanation, okay? Now, conservative Twitter, and yes, Naruto, I agree with your super chat. The past few days have been an enormous black pill. Yes, they have been. Anytime that Nick Fuentes rises to the top as the voice of reason in the goddamn situation is an enormous black pill for any number of... Nick Fuentes has like these nuanced takes. He's like, well, this is all the things you have to think about. Here's what's going on in the region. He knows all. It's like, it's incredible. If you haven't been listening to him talk about this stuff, I'm not saying you need to become a Nick Fuentes fan. I certainly wouldn't condone anyone becoming a groiper, because I think the groipers self-admit that they're a cult as well. So we don't want to be joining any cults. But when he's the guy that has the most nuanced takes in the situation, that should alarm everyone. Anyway, so what conservatives have been doing is saying, and actually I have an example of it in my chat. Spoiler alert, decolonization means genocide. This is currently the conservative take. This is not correct. This is not correct at all. Conservatives are pushing this idea that the far left means decolonization through riots, well, not through riots, through violent overthrow and genocide. Now, with that said, it's not that the far left is opposed to using violence. They're not opposed to using violence. The far left does, in fact, want a socialist, Marxist, communist. I use those three terms interchangeably because they use those three terms interchangeably. The far left does want a Marxist revolution in this country. The far left is not opposed to using violence in order to achieve their Marxist revolution. But right now, the only people who are calling for genocide are not on the far left. They're on the far right. Not even the far right, the conservative right. I won't even say this is the fault of the far right, because they're not. The Nick Fuentes characters have the most nuanced takes of this entire thing. So what I want to do today is I want to hinge us into reality about what the far left actually means when it comes to decolonization. And the way we hinge into reality is to actually listen to them. Because the reason that the far left is winning right now, and yes, they are winning, they're winning resoundingly. It's not even close. The reason the far left is winning right now so resoundingly is because they educate each other all the time. They write books, they do trainings, they hold conferences, they have meetings in coffee shops, they do all this stuff to perpetuate their ideology. And so we have a treasure trove of resources that we can take advantage of them talking about their ideology to each other. And we can sit down and listen to what they mean. And when they tell you what they mean, believe them. Because these people say the quiet part out loud literally all the time. They have no problem in saying the quiet part out loud because they don't think that people like us are ever actually listening. And actually, there's really not that many people like us who are listening. And I don't give a flying fuck what the philosophers say. See, this is another problem, is that where people are getting their information from are dead philosophers. Now, this is a tactic. You're welcome to choose it if you want to. But for my money, I prefer strongly to listen to people who are currently alive teaching their ideology to other people. Taking quotes out of context from dead people that are convenient to call to drag people into a war and to misinform the public, I don't think it's an effective strategy. And I don't give a flying fuck if James Lindsay's doing it on Twitter. I don't think this is responsible. Where this is coming from is James Lindsay posted one page of one document of a dead philosopher that had some things highlighted that if you don't know how to speak socialist like we know how to speak socialist, you are not going to understand them. And that page is currently being circulated all over conservative Twitter, and people are taking it out of context and not understanding what they're seeing because this is not information that they deal with every day, and they are misinterpreting what is actually being said. And even if it was a direct, accurate translation, which it's not, I don't care what dead people said in a paper that was written decades ago. I care what is going on right fucking now with people who are still alive, with people who are still perpetuating this ideology, the people that took the dead philosophy and kept building on it and building on it and building on it and building on it and showing up in the world today. That is what I care about. That is the tactic that we use here. Not everyone wants to do this because it requires sitting down and actually listening to people for hours at a time. And I understand that's not everyone's cup of tea, but that is the tactic that we use here. We listen to people who are currently alive, we listen to them talk to each other, and then we believe them when they say things. Number 2, thank you for the super chat. Even John freaking Doyle called out the conservative bloodlust in his timeline. Doesn't that say something? Doesn't that say something? So today, guys, we are going to go back to our old friends at Haymarket Books, because Haymarket Books is an incredibly socialist book publisher. Haymarket Books are the sponsors of the Literal Socialism Conference. Haymarket Books has a giant back catalog of presentations, and we're going to one that's a couple years old. It is, but I couldn't, even though it's a couple years old, it's just too perfect for what our question is today. Let me read you the description. It is called Decolonization and Its Discontents. This is the description. Decolonization has become a recurring subject in an endless stream of op-eds, think pieces, and books. Yet despite so much ink being spent on the topic, there seems to be little agreement on what exactly we want to achieve by decolonizing something. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting that in a socialist presentation, and this is from a little over 2 years ago, they're saying in the description, we talk about this idea a lot, but we don't actually even agree on what decolonization means. Answering this and clarifying what is at stake in these conversations requires posing additional questions like, what is our relationship to the institution or discipline we want to decolonize? Are we asking for those things to be reformed, or do we want to abolish them altogether? Or is decolonizing a method of critique intended to expose the colonial and racist foundations of the target? And crucially, how do contemporary movements for decolonization, emerging almost exclusively from universities, museums, and art institutions, relate to the aims of achieving the national liberation movements and the dismantled colonial states? The national liberation movement means to liberate us from capitalism. The dismantled colonial states means the overthrow of the United States. So I can't imagine. I know this is a couple years old. I know this is not directly related to the current conflict, but based on the description of this panel, I truly can't imagine like a better session for us to watch if we really want to understand what the far left, today's far left, not 50 years ago far left, today. I can't imagine a better thing to watch to really inform us and hinge us back into reality about what the far left means when they say decolonization. Okay. So hopefully, now, sometimes socialist presentations have nothing to do with the description, and that's really true. But hopefully, this presentation will give us a little bit more insight, and then we can apply those ideas to what's going on today, and we can have discussions about that in the chat. I just think that this is a lot better than running around saying, they mean genocide! The people who are saying that this idea always means genocide are the people that are trying to drag everyone into a war right now. And again, I'm not going to insinuate that socialists don't believe that there should be violence in these movements, because they are not afraid of violence. They will absolutely use violence when it benefits them to use violence. It's not something they're going to shy away from, but that doesn't mean that we should be fear-mongering about what these things actually means. I like to think we have a little bit more of a nuanced perspective on this channel, and I'm not going to get sucked into this outrage trap that is currently existing on the internet. Now, a couple things before we get started. Number one, I do hope you will subscribe to my Substack, which is my main content hub on the internet. It is Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com. I have all sorts of content on there, and And I have all sorts of content on there you can avail yourselves of, including the Woke Mind series, which you see the latest article in right now, How the Cancel Mob Makes You Bend the Knee. This is about how the woke mob will gaslight you when they want you to do something. I've got an update on the woke knitting wars, and I do have my banned shawl completed. This was recently banned in the knitting community. I knitted it anyway because it's not the coolest thing I've ever knitted, but it doesn't look bad. So of course I'm not gonna bend the knee to any cancel mob that's running around saying that's a hate symbol, because that's literally what they're saying. They're saying this is a swastika in the knitting world for real. That's the world that we live in today. There is a possibility. I'm just want to put this in a bug in people's ear. There is a possibility that there might be a spy stream tomorrow around noon-ish. I'm not guaranteeing it, but we may be doing a supporter exclusive spy stream tomorrow. So I just want people to be aware. And Spy Stream is where we go inside a live woke training and we watch it and we talk about it. And we see what they really say when they think we're not listening. If we do the Spy Stream tomorrow, it will only be open to supporters on my Substack, supporters in my local, supporters on my Patreon, YouTube channel members, and Twitter subscribers. I do keep it supporter only because it allows me to manage it a little bit better and actually allows me to pull it off where, if I do it publicly, then someone tells the people who are doing it and they cancel the stream or they kick me out or whatever. So it's just easier to do it supporters only. And the way you would get access to that and any future spy streams that we may do is by joining my Substack as a supporter for $8 a month, $80 a year. Again, you can also join on Locals, Patreon, Twitter, and become a YouTube channel member. That will get you the same access. I do recommend you join the Substack. And again, I'm not guaranteeing we're going to do spy stream tomorrow. I'm not saying it's 100%. I'm saying that there might be something at noon tomorrow. Maybe. No guarantees, but if there is something, I will be sending it out on the Substack in the morning, and then we can do our spy stream at around about noon Eastern, and then we can have the rest of the day, and we'll see what happens. So that's one way you can support the work I'm doing, guys, and I really do appreciate it. Now, hang on. Peter had a chat earlier. Peter says, can I ask a question I really don't have an answer for? What would be the stance of a country in the face of actual genocide? I'm anti-interventionist, but is there a limit? Well, you're arguing, Peter, that Israel is facing an actual genocide. I don't think that Israel is facing an actual genocide. I think that they're facing an inconvenient terrorist group. And I'm not going to suggest that that's an insignificant thing. I absolutely do believe that Israel has the right to defend itself against a terrorist group. However, I find it a little off-putting that, and by the way, Israel is not the only country in the world that has to deal with terrorists. Can we just acknowledge this? Is like the United States has had to deal with terrorists. When 9/11 happened, did we say they're trying to genocide us and then eliminate an entire people over it? No, we didn't. Our response was proportional. I don't think the response to what happened in terms of leveling an entire population and turning Palestine into a parking lot, which is what has been called for by multiple big name conservatives, I don't think that's a reasonable and proportional response. Right now, if Israel was to turn Gaza into a parking lot, that would mean the slaughter of 1 million children. 1 million. Over 1 million. That's not proportional to me. It's just not. And so what I see is a group of people, being Israel, who have a legitimate history with this, and I want to acknowledge that, but they are not currently being genocided. They're just not. Instead, what is happening is the entire international community is calling for the genocide of another people. And that doesn't sit well with me. I'm sorry. Well, it's sure as shit not slaughtering 1 million children. See, this is why I don't engage in this bullshit on the internet. Because you guys are asking, well, what is proportional? What is proportional? You know what it's not? It's not slaughtering 1 million children. That's not proportional. Can we all agree with that? because again, guys, I'm going to be instituting some really specific rules today, because I am completely disgusted with every single person who is trying to rationalize their way into like the absolute bloodlust that's going on right now, the absolute dehumanization of an entire like group of people. It's fucking gross. The amount of people that I see calling Palestinians subhuman, the amount of people I see calling Palestinians, we're not talking about Hamas. We're talking about all Palestinians. The amount of people I see calling all Palestinians animals, the amount of people that it is unbelievable. What I have never been so sick to my stomach in my life as I've been the last several days. And I'm not on anyone's side, but I would hope, dare to dream perhaps, I would hope that maybe we can rally around the idea of not slaughtering a million children that have been living in an open air prison their entire fucking lives. Because that's exactly what Palestine is. It is an open air prison. It has been for a really long time. There are a lot of Jews that don't like when I say that, or a lot of like warmongering conservatives that don't like when I say that, but that's fucking reality. And I'm not going to gloss over it because I'm hurting people's feelings. Armani, thank you for the super chat. Conservatives claim to care about children and be pro-life, yet are validating slaughtering Palestinian children. Yeah. Yes, they are. Yes, they are. So we're gonna watch this this here video to hinge us into reality about. Well, I don't agree with this. I don't agree with this at all. And this brings up Israel must be tyrannical. I am sorry. No, they don't. No, they don't at all in any way. And that's going to bring up the next rule we're going to talk about. Because I have never had so many people in my Twitter feed and my YouTube comments as I've had in the past 24 hours calling for the eradication of an entire people. I am so beyond disgusted with so fucking many of you. And you know who you are. And I am not going to tolerate that. I have had long-time supporters, people who have supported me for literally years, come into my comments and call for a literal genocide in the past couple days. And do you know what I did? I blocked their asses, and they can take their $5 a month or their $8 a month and they can shove it up their ass for all I care, because I am not going to support and pander to this absolute bloodlust, warmongering bullshit that's going on. It's gross. It's disgusting. And if you are going to come into my chat and advocate for a literal genocide, then you can go run off to the Daily Wire, because you will fit in there just great. And I don't care. The money is not worth it, guys. Listen, if there's one thing that I've learned, I had a harsh lesson a couple years ago when a lot of my platform was built among people who were not the right audience for me, because they saw me as some sort of symbol of leaving the left. They didn't see me. They didn't listen to me. It wasn't about my opinions. It wasn't about supporting what I'm trying to do in the world. It was that they saw me as some sort of symbol of a leftist that became a conservative, which never even happened. I learned a lot about building a platform with the wrong audience because I did it accidentally. I'm never doing that again. The money is not worth it, because when you do that, the audience expects you to pander to them and what they want to hear. Peter, if you keep this shit up, I'm blocking you, and I don't care how much support you've given me over the years. If you are warmongering in my chat, if you're saying, I just don't know anything that Israel can do to solve this situation that's not a literal genocide. They just have no choice. They have to be tyrants. I just don't. And all those children are going to grow up to be terrorists anyway. So we may as just take care of the problem. I just don't know how else we can handle it. If you're going to do that shit, I don't care if you've given me hundreds of dollars over the years. I don't care if you've given me thousands of dollars over the years. I don't care if you spread my shit all over the internet. You are not fucking welcome here. If you have those opinions, you can keep them to yourselves. Because I'm not doing it. This will not be a place that we perpetuate that. Kenneth says, thank you. Thank you for the super chat. It's disgusting. Amen. It is disgusting. It is disgusting. Armani, thank you for the super chat. I had to applaud Matt Walsh and Candace Owens, who have also anti-war, anti-interventionist stances concerning Israel and also disavowed people chanting for violence. That is rather shocking to me. That is, but you know what? You got to give credit where credit is due. And if that's the stance they've taken, then it's the right stance. The last week have really, not even week. It hasn't even been a week. The last several days, a lot of people have shown their true colors. I thought I was black-pilled when all the Eliza Blue stuff happened, and I watched all these conservative influencers attack an actual victim of human trafficking, and yes, she is. She told the truth. I am positive of that. Was made into a punchline on the conservative right. I thought I was black-pilled then. I had no idea what it was like to be black-pilled then compared to where I am now. So, we're not going to do that here. I understand that tensions are high. I understand that there are a lot of people who have family in the region. But guess what? If you have family in Israel, there are a lot of people who have family in Palestine too. There are a lot of people who fight, who have family in Gaza right now. How do you think they feel? When you're mourning the Israeli dead, as you should, how do you think people with family in Gaza feel? Watching how the world is mourning all of the people who are dying in Israel. And these are people who mostly don't support Hamas at all. They don't support what's happening. Mark, if you ask a question like this again, which you know is a gotcha question because you know the fucking answer to this, I'm going to block you and I don't care. This is the point that I'm at, guys. No bullshit gotcha questions. I am not playing these fucking games anymore. I am not playing these fucking games. The fact that I even have to say this to people who have been long-term supporters of mine is really disheartening. Really fucking disheartening. And don't think I can't see through the bullshit of every single one of these gotcha questions that you guys have been asking. I know exactly what you're doing, and I'm not falling into the trap. And if you try to push me there, you can go over to the Daily Wire. So, if I see any of that bullshit, that is an insta ban. I'm not relenting on this. Do not fucking test me. We're not doing this here. Okay? Generally speaking, I have 2 rules in my chat. Number 1, don't be a dick. That means you will not insult me. You will not insult other people in the chat. You are in my house. I can do whatever I want. I can say whatever I want. And if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else. Number 2, no whining. If I tell you to stop doing something, you just stop doing it. If you continue to whine in my chat like a child, then I will send you over to the Daily Wire that corrals children all the time, or perhaps you can go over to Tim Pool's channel or Nick Ricada's channel. You can shitpost over there and whine and complain, or go on Twitter and post about how Carlin is so fucking mean. But we're not doing that. We're not doing that here. All right, let's get to our video. For those who just joined, today we are learning about the far left perspective on what decolonization actually means. This is a presentation from a socialist publisher from 2 years ago. This is not current. This is 2 years old. It doesn't matter though, because what they're talking about are themes. And so I want to listen to them talk about decolonization. I want us to be able to pull learnings from that, to be able to talk about how this might apply to the situation that we are currently in. If you have never watched socialism with me before, then this might be a little overwhelming. We will do our very, very best in order to break it down for you and explain what they mean, but this is also a newer area for me. So keep in mind, I'm going to be learning this stuff on the fly. And so I know more than the average bear, but I don't know everything. I'm learning in real time as well. Many people have been watching socialism with me for over a year now, so people can answer questions in the chat. If you have questions, please ask them. If you feel like you don't understand what's being said, that's probably because you haven't watched enough socialism yet, because these people do speak in a coded language. It can be a little bit harder for people to understand, but we will get through it together and we'll come out on the other side being much more hinged into reality than most of the conservative right is right now. And I think that that's possibly a really good thing. So, Milo, I think, well, you're not far off there. Again, I want to say, so this is my too long didn't read for my current interpretation of colonization and decolonization. Colonization relates to property. An oppressive force, usually meaning capitalism. In socialism, oppression means capitalism. So an oppressive force, capitalism, comes in and takes land away from indigenous people. That's what colonization is. They privatize the land and use it to uplift capitalism within the society and build a society grounded in whiteness, because whiteness means capitalism. We know that. I think that decolonization means taking back the land, taking back the private property, and then making it public and getting rid of the influences of capitalism associated with it. Okay? So does that make sense to everyone? Colonization means the oppressive force of capitalism comes in, and when you're talking about a physical space, takes the land and makes it private property. Decolonization means that the oppressed people take the private property back and liberate it from the oppressive force of capitalism. I feel like I have to say this 5,000 times. I am not suggesting that the far left does not support the use of violence, because they do support the use of violence. Well, they remove the influences of capitalism with it. So it's public. It's not privately owned, which is of course the point. It's owned by the government. It's owned by the state. It's owned by the Marxists. That's why. Yes, kind of like an eminent domain situation. That's exactly right. Good analogy. So that's my, and again, so I'm not suggesting they don't think there'll be violence involved. I am suggesting that I don't think decolonization means genocide, which is what's been going around lately. Okay, let's get this party started, guys.
Welcome to our third Salvage Live event, brought to you by Haymarket Books and Salvage, a journal of revolutionary arts and letters. Issue 10 of Salvage is being printed and sent to subscribers as we speak, and it is full of poetry, art, and essays ranging from Palestine to 5-year retrospectives on Brexit. All of them hope to deepen and to inform the life of the left, and the essay we discuss today is no exception. We're delighted to have a Salvage author with us, Kevin Akoff. In the strange and surprising left resurgence that marked the second half of the last decade in Europe and the United States, exciting and cautious all at once, exhilarating and disappointing in turn, the left found need of agitation and propaganda, agitprop. With these events, though, we're trying to do something different, to offer a stage for the questions we must ask but cannot always answer, the thorny debates we have and the ones we should have. In our first two events, we discussed debt, credit, and the shape of a socialist political economy today, and then the vexed question of contemporary fascism. Now to the politics of race, nation, and empire. Too rarely does radical politics today interrogate its lexicons. They've changed dramatically. How did we get from anti-colonialism, a name that centers its revolutionary subject, to decolonization, at first a process without a subject? How did we move from decolonizing land to decolonizing reading lists? If these changes are noticed at all, they're usually addressed by partisans, those nostalgic for old languages or scorning them in the name of the new. But what historical transformations might explain these shifts in the gaze and the language of political militants? These are some of the questions we'll ask in this event. This will be Salvage Live. We're your two hosts. I'm Barnaby Rain, and this is Annie Ololoku Tariba. Annie, take it over.
Thank you, Barnaby. So, in 2015, a bucket of feces over a statue of Cecil Rhodes thrust the question of decolonization into the center stage once again. How are we meant to understand ourselves as post-colonial when everywhere around us, hagiographic symbolism embeds itself in the architecture?
What does the word colonizer mean, do you think? Does anyone have any ideas? They're talking about removing statues. So what does the term colonizer mean? This should be an easy one. Pop quiz. Capitalist. Ding, 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 ding. Capitalist. Exactly. Capitalist. Capitalist. Property owners. The people who want to take the land. The oppressive form of capitalism. Capitalist. Capitalist. Exactly. Well done. But what does that mean? What does imperialist mean to socialists? What does invader mean to socialists? Means capitalist.
Truly, Cecil Rhodes' colonial misadventures were a thing of the past, then why did contemporary imperial and settler societies cling to his memory so quickly? One would have been forgiven for thinking that the challenge were merely emotional, of the mundane inhumanity of seeing one's colonizer celebrated in a supposedly post-colonial state. It would have been neater than.
You're repeating conservative talking points, and that's not what we're doing here today, so I'm going to ask you to stop. I'm going to ask you to stop. Your sentence here, and I'm sorry I just spit down on a cough drop. Hang on. Your sentence here doesn't mean anything. Decolonization is the act of destruction which recreates the colonized as a free people. That doesn't fucking mean anything. The act of destruction, which means to abolish and overthrow capitalism and private property. What does free people mean? Free people to socialists means to liberate people from capital. This is the fucking problem. Hang on. This is the fucking problem. With James Lindsay taking one page out of a paper that was written God knows how long ago and putting it on Twitter and not explaining to people what the language actually means. No fucking shit, he's not a conservative. The people who are conservatives are the people who took a one-page screenshot and put it all over Twitter with certain words highlighted, but conservatives don't know the language that they're fucking reading, and so they don't know how to interpret the information. So let me break it down for you conservatives that are pushing this shit in my chat right now. Decolonization is the act of destruction. The act of destroying what? What are we destroying? Do you guys even know? Do you even know what the act of destruction means? Because it's not a reference to violence. That's not what it is, which recreates the colonized as a free people. Free from what? Free from what? This is proof right here that conservatives don't know what the fuck they're talking about, because how they're interpreting this is you have to kill the colonizer. Killing the colonizer, it's violent revolution, violent revolution, violent revolution. That's not what they mean. So people who are smarter than this person, can we break this language down in the chat, please? Decolonization is the act of destruction. The act of destroying what? What are they destroying? Which recreates the colonized as a free people. What does that mean? What does it mean for people to be free under socialism? Decolonization is liberation from capitalism. It's as simple as that. Deconstruction, the capitalist ideology. Freedom from capitalism. That's what this means, guys. That's what this means. And I'm really sorry if you were confused by all that shit that was going around on Twitter. I'm sure you feel personally targeted right now because I'm yelling at you and have raised my tone of voice. But this is a reflection of my frustration with this entire problem. James Lindsay, I'm sorry. I adore James Lindsay and his work, and I think that it is incredibly important. James Lindsay was irresponsible when he put that on Twitter yesterday. It was irresponsible because he's putting language out there that people do not understand. Decolonization is the act of destruction of capitalism, the act of destruction of private property, which creates the colonized as a free people. That means free people under socialism means a world free of capitalism. That's what it means. You cannot apply the same definitions that you use because you are not a socialist to what socialists actually believe. We may have the, who says this? I think Rottweiler says this all the time. We may have the same vocabulary, but we have a different definition, okay? They are not opposed to using violence. They're not opposed to it at all. But that doesn't mean that decolonization necessarily means violent revolution. It might, it also might not. The violence may not be necessary. And in the way that socialists are actually taking on different institutions in society right now, they're not overthrowing our society in a way that requires violence because they're doing it through getting in influential positions of power, not through politics, through institutional power. They're overthrowing institutions, and they are quite literally architecting different forms of society in order to create an act of destruction, which is getting rid of capitalism, which recreates the colonized as a free people, which means liberating people from capitalism. I'm sorry to be frustrated. I really am, but I'm just really upset at how much misinformation has been spread. James Lindsay doesn't realize how much his followers don't understand. This is exactly correct. And again, I have nothing but respect and admiration for James Lindsay. He has done the Lord's work. He was doing something before I even knew this was a problem. But I think where James Lindsay fails sometimes, not all the time, is in explaining the language to his followers, because he skips over several steps in his head and he assumes people understand things that they don't necessarily mean. I agree. James Lindsay's followers are getting kind of Gnostic. Yes, they are. Yes, they are. So, guys, if you follow him, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I want everyone to be really hinged into reality about what these words actually mean. Thank you for giving me the example to use. What was his Katzen? I didn't mean to personally attack you. That wasn't my intention. but I'm just really deeply frustrated with this entire situation, and that's why we're watching this video today. Exactly. It means capitalism, overthrowing capitalism, perhaps through violent means, perhaps through other means. Let's continue.
That way, tearing down some statues, scheduling some decolonial healing consultations, shoehorning some writers of color onto the reading list. We watched as native hysteria was co-opted and revolutionary fervor commodified. All around us, the zeal to decolonize is turning a profit for the same institutions of empire. Book deals, research grants, professorships abound, diversity politics in native face, yielding everything but a sturdy solidarity when the colonized actually resist. And what is the afterlife of a colonialism which never died? Decolonization, once the language of empires ridding themselves of territories which were no longer profitable, the language which sought to craft newly dependent states, blunted the sword of anti-colonial resistance and now purports a radical transition. So what does this transition look like to the Palestinian people of Sheikh Jarrah, who are rendered in this decolonization of mind as an uncomfortable?
Decolonization of mind. Did you just hear that? Decolonization of mind. Decolonization doesn't mean violence. It means getting the oppressive ideas of capitalism out of your mind in this particular case. Pike Bishop says, by any means necessary, which doesn't have to include violence in every instance. In fact, it's actually much more effective for the far left if decolonization is not a violent movement. The way that socialists operate and the far left operates, it's covert, man. Most of the time, you don't even know what they're doing. Most of the time, you don't know what strategies they're using until it's already too late. All right? They're actually much more effective when it's not violence. They're much more effective when it's so subtle that you don't even realize what's happening until it's already too late. And that's what they spend most of their time doing.
Anachronism. And how might we understand our relationship to Europe as we reconstitute it and revive it once again? Sorry.
Good point, Reagan.
And how might we understand our relationship to Europe as we reconstitute it and revive it once more? As our resistance to Eurocentricity finds us in opposition to the politics of the radical anti-colonial movements on whose shoulders we stand. Today, we're going to talk about a number of different aspects of the question of decolonization. And we're really excited to be joined by our guest, Kevin Akoth. And so I'm going to start by asking Kevin a question. Kevin, in your article, Decolonization and Its Discontents, you begin by talking about the question of UCT, the University of Cape Town, and how the Rhodes Must Fall movement as emerged from UCT spread across the world. And so I wondered, what was it about South Africa in that moment which made it so ripe for a new movement of decolonization?
I think it's particularly in South Africa, it's kind of the unfinished process, I think, of post-apartheid reconciliation that kind of brings a lot of tension to the fore, specifically at kind of like a historically white institution like UCT, which kind of, in some ways, with its symbolism and its curriculum, stands in for like a reminder of basically...
Okay, guys, this guy's mic is really soft. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn down my mic volume. And I need everyone to work together because this is just the way we have to do it. I need you to turn up your personal volume. I'm turning up my personal volume. So hopefully now we will be more in line.
That unfinished process of decolonization, or whatever we might call it that, in South Africa as a whole. So I think that's particularly why at that moment, it was very, very important for that conversation to take off in that context. It then spread, obviously, as you know, Annie, quite far and wide, and took off in Oxford as well, which another situation where it's kind of a lot of symbolism in Oxford is kind of reminds us of this unfinished process of decolonization, not just the Rhodes statue, but various other kind of street names, buildings. And there's constant reminders in that kind of, just in the physical space about that process of basically that remind us about the continued kind of colonial legacies that are still with us today. So I think UCT was an interesting place for me to start with the essay, Just in particular also because I think it's kind of looking back now, that was in 2015.
Can someone give me a too long didn't read of this? Okay, so here is what I vaguely remember. I vaguely remember a couple years ago, maybe it was a year ago, maybe it was a couple years ago, I'm not sure, but people talking about South Africa being the logical end result of critical race theory, but I don't follow international stuff all that much, so I don't know off the top of my head what actually happened. And I still sound a little bit loud, so I'm going to turn myself down a little bit more to hopefully level out the volume. But if people could give me like a too long didn't read of what happened in South Africa, that'd be great.
And I think looking back, a lot of people have started to kind of have the conversation of, okay, what happened and how was the institution able to basically respond to what was a very radical impulse for kind of quite radical change? And how was the institution able to neutralize that process and kind of co-opt the language of decolonization to push basically what then amounted to...
Hang on. Akshay says, I watched a video of a rabbi give a lecture about the decolonization of the mind and the Jewish consciousness, but he meant removing the influence of countries they went to during the diaspora. That's interesting, Akshay. I appreciate that. So H. Tom says that South Africa has racial quotas in every field, have led to a complete breakdown of technology. Riots have all but destroyed, looted private businesses, white farmers massacred. Oh, so it is the logical end result of critical race theory, isn't it? You're right about that. Critical race theory, of course, is Marxism. It's designed to build a society of equity. What does equity mean? How do we build an equitable society? Pop quiz for the chat. How do we build an equitable society according to the far left? It's really simple. Everyone should know the answer to this. The answers are always the same. How do we build an equitable society according to the far left? We destroy capitalism. Exactly. Equity is about controlled outcomes. Yes, but what does that really mean? How do you get controlled outcomes? You destroy capitalism. You get rid of meritocracy. You usher in socialism. No capitalism. You get rid of capitalism. Equity means Marxism. Equity means socialism. Oh, and look at that. There's no private property in South Africa. Oh, look at that. A hallmark of socialism. Exactly.
Not much more than diversity initiatives. So I think it was very obvious kind of, I think in the essay I talk a little bit about the report that came out, I think in 2019.
Thank you.
That kind of tries to work through some of the things that happened with the Roads Must Fall movement at UCT. And I think I found the language of the report really, really surprising because it was kind of saying, oh, the problem at UCT was a suppression of Black excellence, or it was using language along those lines, which basically has very little to do with the initial impulse for decolonization that I think the student movement itself was pushing for. So I do think that's like a very, very good example to kind of look at the pushback and how the institutions were able to co-opt that. And I think specifically also the image that we saw earlier of kind of that airlift of basically just the statue being lifted off campus, being not a kind of radical act of it being dragged.
Oh, Elena's giving, okay. In South Africa, they redistributed the farmlands to people who didn't know how to farm and have managed to starve a load of people. Oh, so this is literally equity in action, isn't it? That should terrify everyone.
Back down or something. It's actually the university deciding to take power back into its own hands, basically, and remove the statue in the way that it would like to, rather than it being like a kind of a gesture that would kind of push a more radical movement to then continue on. So it's kind of like cutting out the momentum of that particular process of that movement towards decolonization. So I think, so that was for me very, very interesting to kind of think about at first, and also to kind of then use that as a springboard to start talking about colonization more broadly, decolonization more broadly, as we kind of like speak about it in, for instance, universities in the UK and the US today, and kind of, what are these kind of conversations that we're trying to have, and what is it that we're really trying to do? To
be really clear, I think James Lindsay is a genius. And God bless him for what he's doing, because I have some experience with this now, and I'm not doing what I am doing is not as complicated as what he's doing. And I think he's a genius. But geniuses sometimes can make bad calls, and I think him releasing that one page with a couple highlighted words, not explaining to people what it meant, I think that was a bad call. Yes, this is correct. You have to think that Marx thought communism was our natural state, and so it's a point of return for all of us, the original state. We've talked about this. I had an international relations professor in college that was actually Billy Corgan's uncle, Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins, which was weird, but he taught us that communism was the highest of all form of society. Welcome, Vardy. I don't normally yell at people like I did at the beginning, but it's been a stressful couple of days.
And it's, you know, what allows even, you know, one of my alma maters is SOAS to do kind of basically use the language of decolonization quite a lot and kind of use the co-op these student initiatives for decolonization while having, I mean, it's basically the strongest links to the Foreign Office, various kind of like multinationals, the development sector. And yeah, so I think it's kind of like the university was a really, really good point for me to try and start this essay into thinking about, well, what are all these things we want to speak about when we speak about decolonization? And I think particularly just like a small comment, I think there was just like a couple of months ago, for instance, is just an example of kind of what happens with this language when it kind of gets neutralized is, it was not the author's fault, but I think Al Jazeera Opinions published a piece that kind of, where they put the headline in there that said, decolonize the IMF, which is just a bizarre kind of phrase in itself. And I don't think it was the author's fault, but for someone in the editorial to think of putting that as a headline kind of points to something having gone quite wrong between the historical process of decolonization, which we have in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and kind of the way we speak about it today.
Isn't that funny,
Interesting.
Kurt?
And I do think that this kind of speaks
Isn't
to
that funny?
the relationship between decolonization of old and decolonization today, where historically, and Barnaby pointed to this in his introduction, you had a decolonizing frame versus an anti-colonial frame. A comrade of mine who was involved in the Palestinian Revolution talked about how they didn't have a word for decolonization, but they had a word for liberation, right? And
Decolonization.
So at that time, decolonization.
So she just conflated the term decolonization with liberation. Liberation means to free oneself from capitalism. So decolonization would be similar to that in the language of socialist.
Was essentially the managed process of statecraft, of a new kind of state, the dependent.
Decolonization is where did I rewind that and listen to that again? I shouldn't have paused so soon. Decolonization is the manage of statecraft to create a new state. In this case, they mean a state free from capitalism. Let's listen to this part again.
How they didn't have a word for decolonization, but they had.
And I'm gonna go a little bit more.
Old and decolonization today, where historically, and Barnaby pointed to this in his introduction, you had a decolonizing frame versus an anti-colonial frame. A comrade of mine who was involved in the Palestinian Revolution talked about how they didn't have a word for decolonization, but they had a word for liberation, right? And so at that time, decolonization was essentially the managed process of statecraft, of a new kind of state, the dependent state, the gatekeeper state that would essentially take over from colonial authority.
Colonial authority
and it seems
means
to me
capitalism.
That there's a striking mirror in the way in which contemporary languages or discourses of decolonization are often asking things of institutions and of states which are themselves implicated in colonial practices. And I wondered if you thought there was any way of salvaging the language of decolonization, or if that's something that's deeply embedded in it and inescapable.
Well, I think that's kind of, I think maybe we'll get to some resolution of this particular question as we kind of go along. But I think kind of with the salvageable part of decolonization, I find it's like a very difficult thing to think about because because this process of asking these institutions that are like so implicated in this process of like basically the statecraft that leads to not decolonization, but rather to different formations, like basically, you know, we have neo-colonial states, or kind of, you know, the continuation of settler colonialism, or like institutions that perpetuate that, and kind of asking from them to basically decolonize something is kind of asking for a top-down kind of thing to be given, basically. So I think there's something salvageable in the language of decolonization, but I think there's something salvageable in it if we, I think, which is also kind of something that I try to talk about in the essay, if we kind of try to also reconnect to political economy and these questions of statecraft and questions of the nation state. Because without, I think, those particular questions, in my opinion, then I think, which is also what I'm kind of trying to argue in the essay, is then it becomes a relatively empty signifier that kind of can be neutralized in this way as the universities have done it. And that can be co-opted in these ways if it's not kind of combined with a very radical critique of political economy.
Radical means socialist.
Economy. And if it's not kind of asking these very, very difficult questions about what kind of state, or what's the role of the state in this process of kind of disentangling basically these formerly independent states from the colonial relationships with their former colonizers, and what are the things that are required for these kind of states to break away. And yeah, so I think it's, unless we ask those very difficult questions, which I think is kind of what we're getting into today, I think the language of decolonization is pretty empty. And I think particularly the language of decolonial studies sometimes I find very frustrating, because it kind of makes a very concerted effort to distance itself from these specifically the questions that I think are very, very important to ask today.
Sarah with an H asks, Carlin, is the webinar still available for new people? Yes, it is. If you want to watch my How to Speak Socialist webinar from last week, as a good introductory method to like learning how to decode some of their language, it is available on carlin.substack.com. I'm pretty sure it's still relatively high up on the page, but if you go to the session, it is. If you scroll down a little bit, it's actually one of the first things that comes up under right below the fold. But if you go to the section called My Day with the Socialists, it's literally right at the top of the page. So that is still available if people want to find that over on my Substack. Thank you for asking. I'll pop the link in the chat.
Basically makes this retreat into tradition, or like kind of some an imagined form of indigeneity that I don't see as particularly helpful going forward if we really want to think about these questions.
So it seems like we are identifying two processes in change from an old language of anti-colonial revolution in the mid-20th century to a language of decolonial studies, partisans, people like Walter Mignolo, Maldonado Torres, you pick up in the essay that you've written for Salvage. It seems like the two changes are, on the one hand, a move from an anti-colonial language which is optimistic about the agency of the oppressed to a decolonial language which names a process. Initially, this is, I think, the irony Annie was just getting at, the language of decolonization was a language that came.
Socialists always suck at technology. It's them, not us. Look, Bartley, the other guy's still moving. Kevin is still moving. Barnaby is totally frozen.
Wait for a second for Barnaby to come back.
Yeah, it's their Wi-Fi. It's not us, guys. It's them.
I think where he was going is in terms of, I think I can pick up the thread on kind of this basically subjectivity and kind of agency, I think, as well. Because I think there's like a little section in the essay as well where I kind of draw quite a bit on the work of Sylvia Kusuponki, who kind of criticizes decolonial studies precisely for...
I just literally noticed the hammer and sickle in the upper right-hand corner. Oh, I love socialists so much. They're so funny.
This kind of like erasure of a particular kind of agency in the decolonial process, because basically the indigenous person in that discourse just becomes kind of just an archaic thing from the past, which I think Anya also mentioned earlier. It's kind of just becomes like a relic from the past that's there to represent everything that's opposed to modernity, for example. And I think that's a very different image from kind of the way anti-colonial movements would mobilize. And I think that kind of shift in language is especially troubling for me, I think. But I think it has to do quite a lot with, I think, what Annie and I were also going to talk about as well, because that's something I try to also address, is it has something to do also with the US Academy and its relationship to kind of the people that it studies, and basically the process of the language of decolonial studies and decolonization becoming quite enshrined in the institution, basically, in the US Academy, which makes it kind of, which builds.
That was subtle. What does he mean when he says the U.S. Academy? Pop quiz. I know the answer to this because I worked in the U.S. Academy for a long ass time. What does he mean when he says the U.S. Academy? It's not capitalism, bot. No, it's not capitalism. Universities, academia, universities, the colleges. When you work in higher education, as I did for about 10 years, you will hear faculty members calling it the academy, darling. And so what was Kevin here just saying? He was saying that the language of decolonization is pervasive within the academy. Let's listen again.
It has to do quite a lot with, I think, what Annie and I were also going to talk about as well, because that's something I try to also address, is it has something to do also with the US Academy and its relationship to kind of the people that it studies, and basically the process of the language of decolonial studies and decolonization becoming quite enshrined in the institution, basically, in the US Academy, which makes it kind of, which builds this process of kind of having.
The language is enshrined in the institution. When socialists want to do something, guys, they don't need violence. They fuck with the language. When socialists want to change things, they go in, they take over institutions, they change the language, they get people speaking their language within the institution, and that's how they brainwash an entire, several generations of people, anyone who comes through that institution. They don't need violence to overthrow capitalism.
Basically, subjects, you don't treat the subjects of your decolonial process as subjects. And then it's kind of using them just basically to make this argument about the coloniality of knowledge, while kind of existing in these structures that are so implicated in kind of this in the continuity of the colonial process. So it's kind of this contradiction of sitting in this one institution, which is not a personal fault necessarily, but it's kind of like, if the theoretical discourse basically justifies this kind of relationship to these broader indigenous struggles, for example, then I don't think it's a particularly useful way to approach the process of decolonization.
Yes, Sarah with an H, great point. This happened at Evergreen. Exactly. Well, it happened in every college, but this happened at Evergreen.
Thank you.
Yep, this is also true, everyday therapist. Exactly. That woman's child is always crying. We watched her yesterday too. Child came in, got involved. I don't know why no one's talking right now. Barnaby, where are you? Why are we having an awkward...
Shall we just continue talking?
Yes, we should continue talking, Kevin. Socialists have no idea what's going on. I know this was 2 years ago, but their use of technology hasn't gotten any better.
So I think there is something to be said also about...
Talking is capitalism. Kevin is like being left his own. They're decolonizing the presentation.
I can just wait till either Annie or Barnaby come back. I think I can just.
This is
somewhat
what
related
decolonization
to what we
looks
were
like in
talking about.
practice.
I
An
think
epic
just the conversation
shit
between
show.
decolonial studies and kind of this older tradition of like anti-colonial thinking is exemplified, I think, quite well in kind
The
of the critique
Wi-Fi
that
has been
decolonial studies has
decolonized.
of the late Samir, and I think it's kind of basically there's a lot of accusations of Samir Amin trying to basically fight coloniality on its own terms and being very unsuccessful in that kind of process. I think
Barnaby doesn't realize his microphone is on.
Way too, it's kind of obsessed with the purity of the decolonial project rather than kind of the messy.
All right. Socialists suck at technology. Remember, what's going on right now is that black woman is trying to parent her crying child in the background. She doesn't realize that she left her microphone on so that we can hear everything. This guy's trying desperately to give some sort of presentation. Barnaby is off in technical Zoom hell. So I know this is wacky, guys. We just gotta roll with it, though. This is just what socialists are like. Yes, and I just want everyone to keep this in mind, that the reason we have to sit here and watch this is these people are fucking winning. Our side is so ineffective that these people are kicking our asses up and down the playing field.
Practicality. Some sort of liberation within the context of actually existing post-colonialism and actually existing capitalist modernity. And it seems to be more concerned with the purity of this theoretical discourse and the actual process, which is a lot more messy than that, of trying to disentangle from these colonial relationships. And I think that's kind of exemplified. So I think the kind of decolonial studies, Minolo has this critique very prominently of Samir Amin, I think exemplifies kind of the tension between decoloniality as a kind of discourse and kind of the older anti-colonial tradition and the people who have kind of come from that and have built on that. Mm-hmm.
One, and I'm very sorry, by the way, for viewers who are just beginning to get accustomed to our Salvage Live norms of dealing with technological issues and baby issues all at once. I said last time when we had this problem, and I'm sure it'll keep happening, that even online we're still the left, so we still have to be chaotic. But I wanted to ask you about these kind of two processes that I think we're naming at once in the contemporary move to a language of decolonization, which is on the one hand this thing which you've now given us a great account of in terms of the move from anti-colonial agency and subjectivity to a decolonial process. At the same time as academia encourages us to celebrate constantly the agency of the oppressed, sometimes in ways that are kind of naive.
Academia encourages this bullshit he just said.
But at the same time as we have this kind of paranoid desire to celebrate agency, it's because we've lost faith maybe in anti-colonial revolutionary agency, which was a mid-20th century process. And instead now we have the need to decolonize from the center using that language of decolonization that comes from Britain and France, not from anti-colonial revolution, as Annie was pointing out, Palestinian friends saying they didn't have an Arabic word for it. They had a word for liberation. So at the same time as that's happening, there's also a move from anti-colonial revolution to decolonial process. And there's also a move, as I mentioned at the start, from decolonizing land, nations, to decolonize your mind, decolonize your reading list, a move from colonialism as a fact to colonialism as a kind of metaphor. And I wonder how we think about these two processes happening at once in the contemporary language of decolonization.
Yes, Barnaby, we wonder that too.
Like there's one way in which that second process could look like a kind of political advance, which is to say, okay, take David Scott takes a text like Edward Said's Orientalism and says, this is the moment where you say, we've liberated countries. Of course, that's not Said because he's Palestinian, but we've liberated lots of countries and seen that liberation isn't total. So now we have to go on to think about these deeper problems of culture and ideology in which colonial power relations still reside. So it could look like a kind of radicalization beyond just we need national governments. Too, we need to question all of the basic rudiments of our society and its formation through racial power and colonial power. But at the same time, it's also a kind of retreat away from the possibility of politics, away from the possibility of transforming your social relations, away from questions of political economy, because you're at the end of history and don't really believe, and you're, in David Scott's terms, you're after the Bandung moment. You don't really believe anymore in the possibility of social transformation, not because you're just an idiot pessimist, but because that possibility really is retreating. So it seems to me there's this tension between a kind of possibility of an advance through the language of decolonization extending into new realms, which surely are, education surely is an important.
No! Barnaby! Come back!
Sorry,
They're all so posh that none of their internet ever works. Nuritu, thank you for the super chat. Glenn Beck is going to have Ben Shapiro and Dave Rubin on to discuss the Israel-Gaza situation. Oh, yeah. I suspect that's going to be an epic dumpster fire of warmongering.
Sorry, I was just gone for a second, my bad connection. I was saying these new realms surely are real spaces in which colonial power resides, like the university. And it might be subtler than the policeman's baton or the soldier's gun, but it's important to the reproduction of colonial power. And someone like Steve Biko in South Africa was talking this subtler language of psychological liberation, even in that anti-colonial moment in the 70s. So do we think of the turn from the anti-colonial to the decolonial just as a negative thing? Or do we think of it as something that could have been positive, but was kind of overdetermined by...
What do we think the difference is between anti-colonial and decolonial? I don't know the answer to that. I'm honestly posing the question, and I hope they explain the difference. But what do they think the difference is between anti-colonial and decolonial? I don't know how decolonial would be different necessarily than anti-colonial.
A moment of retreat historically in world historic terms, rather than being an advance. Is there a possibility? I know as someone, as was Annie, who was involved in the Rose Must Fall campaign in Oxford, that many of the people charting that campaign wanted to use the statue as an opportunity to talk about racism in ways very different from those that were then picked up by the British establishment, which wanted to make it all...
Well, this is an interesting idea. Anti-colonial is an external process, whereas decolonial is an internal one. Joe S. thought decolonial is to undo it. So, okay. So if we this might actually be okay. So if we think about like how to be an anti-racist, right? Or like anti-racist baby by Ibram X. Kendi, awful person, is like the idea of like you're going to use all these anti-racist tactics with your kids so they don't grow up and become racist even if they're white and are inherently racist and all that. Whereas like anti is I'm thinking through this as I'm saying it, so don't hold me to this. Anti is like, hang on, bot seems to have some sort of definition. Decoloniality refers to logic, Bot, I don't think this is helpful. Refers to logic, metaphysics, ontology, and matrix of power created by massive processes and aftermath. Okay, that's not helpful at all. That doesn't mean anything. So, I don't think that actually meant anything. Anti is against. Decolonization is the act of it. Okay, so okay. Let's just listen to them. Maybe they'll define it.
About, in a contemporary language, the microaggression caused by walking past a statue, which was an aggressive statue of a hateful racist, where many of the people authoring the campaign wanted to talk about racism much more broadly. So how contested do you think is the terrain of decoloniality? Is it owned by the likes of Mignolo? And what openings does it provide?
Katzen is saying the process of anti-colonialization is to remove capitalism and then you decolonize to build socialism. But that doesn't make sense, though, because D doesn't mean build something. D means like destroy something. No, we do not use the term praxis here. The term praxis doesn't mean anything to people. I don't know that we're there yet, guys.
For the left, if it charts a defeat and a kind of possible advance in the 70s, 80s moment.
So I don't think it's, I think you're completely right. I don't think it's monopolized by basically the likes of Mignolo and the Decolonial Study School. And I think it leaves space for a lot of other...
It's also possible. Well, it's not there. This is a practical... Marx is not practical. This is practical, okay? Socialism is obviously not their natural state because they're talking about living in a non-socialist society. So that's not exactly a practical application of it. Okay, so it is entirely possible, guys, that in terms of remember, I'm not doing philosophical bullshit on this channel. We get down to brass tacks on this channel and we think about how these ideas actually impact us in real life. It is entirely possible that in terms of practical impact, things that are going to matter to you and me, not philosophy, in terms of practical impact, it might be that anti-colonization and decolonization actually mean the same thing in terms of how they show up in the world. It's like how socialists have 85 different words that all mean capitalism. No one understands what the word praxis is. I refuse to use it. Normal people do not understand it. The only people who kind of somewhat understand the term praxis are people who follow James Lindsay, but most people do not follow James Lindsay, which is why I do not use it. Practical people understand. Praxis people do not understand. So in terms of how it's actually impacting our lives, they could mean the same thing.
Kind of options, and I do agree that we can treat it as an advance, basically. But I think even if we think about the language, for instance, of decolonizing our minds, which comes from Ngugi, but the way Ngugi is kind of talking about decolonizing the mind is not purely as that.
How many people in this chat know what the word praxis means? I'm sorry, but your mom's lived experience is not indicative of everyone, and we're talking to normal people here. How many people in the chat know what the word praxis means? Without Googling it, bot. Off the top of your head, how many people know what the word means? Yeah, see, you don't even know for sure. This is the problem. This is the problem. We're trying to decode this stuff for normal people. Rottweiler, I knew you were going to know what it meant, but most normal people just don't know what the word means. And this is why we don't use it.
That you can read another essay from exactly the same period, which is very much interested in kind of building of institutions, for instance, and kind of the process of state building and the questions around nationhood. And it's kind of, it doesn't basically sideline
Socialists don't even use the word praxis.
Just to talk about only decolonizing the mind. So I think it's kind of a thing that must happen basically at the same time. But I think the problem more that I had with, is kind of with the dominant kind of way of talking about decoloniality, it kind of pushes those questions aside rather than trying to address them simultaneously. And kind of the question of knowledge gets separated from the questions of kind of the political economy of higher education, for example, which it very much cannot be separated from, but it kind of then becomes this more abstract thing. And I think also just what you're talking about, kind of the post kind of Bandung moment and kind of the shift towards kind of more an interest in these broader critiques. I think it's kind of because the story of national liberation has been told as, I think in retrospect, as sort of kind of inevitable process. It kind of is this process that inevitably leads to retrenchment of the nation state. And it inevitably leads to kind of this kind of taking on of the state form of, that was the colonial state form. And I think that kind of, I think what I'm trying to push for also in the essay is a reconsideration of kind of that idea that it was inevitable, or questioning of the idea that it was inevitable. Because the process by which that happened, there's a lot of kind of messy stuff that takes place. I think, so I was writing something else recently about particularly political assassinations during the period, like in, for example, Kenya between kind of 63 and maybe like the 70s. And that actually made like a huge difference in terms of the types of kind of proposals for a different type of economic program that could be implemented, and kind of leads to basically a defensive kind of a colonial type state that's structured around primary commodity exports, for example. And so it's kind of those options. I think it's what Adam Getachev as well points out, I think very well, is that I think it's engaging in the same project, which is trying to go back and also kind of figure out what these alternatives to what was the outcome what was then the outcome of those processes of decolonization, is what were these alternatives that existed at the height of decolonization? And is there anything to be kind of salvaged from that particular moment, and that could help us in thinking about what we want to achieve when we think about decolonization today even? So I think it's kind of the tension between those is, there is an advance, of course, but I think the advance has come at the expense of kind of sidelining this other conversation that I think also needs to be had alongside it. So there is some sort of advance in being able to talk about kind of these curricula, because you do need to talk about the curricula, for instance. But I think in absence of kind of this big critique of, there's also the long conversation that's been going on for many years about the decline of the African university. And it's impossible to talk about that without talking about neocolonialism, for example, or the way kind of these economies are essentially plundered. So it's kind of, you can't really have that conversation
capitalism
about decolonizing knowledges without talking about, okay, what led to the decline of the African university, for example. And then you have to ask yourself broader questions about the structure of capitalist imperialism today. And
here we go. Ketson, this is a really good, I think, perspective. Anti-colonialism removes the colonizer, but leaves the colonized form of state. So it removes the bourgeois, but it leaves the capitalism. Decolonization removes the colonized form of the state, so it removes the capitalism. I can possibly get behind that. Oh God, fucking Midwestern Marx. Maybe we'll watch that. Midwestern Marx is about to do a stream in a couple hours about Gaza resisting a Zionist extermination campaign. We might have to stream snipe this. We might have to. Who's up for pissing off Midwestern Marx tonight? It's always fun when we piss off Midwestern Marx. I do see where you're going with it, Ketz, and I think that could be an interesting way to look at it. I might be on board with that. All right, let me look into it.
So I think it's just kind of having, basically those conversations need to happen alongside each other. And I think I'm more pushing from the other angle to bring this old anti-colonial, those priorities also back to the forefront and into the conversation, which I think have been relatively unfairly dismissed.
Yeah, I mean, you have in the essay an amazing example of this, which is a single term and its different uses, which is, you point out that people in decolonial studies use the term delinking to talk about their project and say, well, of course, this is the term that Samir Amin famously used. And when Samir Amin was talking about the Marxist third worldist, when Samir Amin was talking about delinking, he meant, controversial though it was, including on the radical left, a program of delinking from the capitalist world system. It was about trying to change how value chains worked. And it was a politics that, of course, had its antecedents and its advocates from Nehru to Thomas Sankara, of people talking in an anti-colonial moment about primary commodity producers being locked into dependence on trade relations with the colonizer. And then you say, and now when people talk about delinking, when in an essay where Montemagnola talks about it, for example.
Yeah, so Ketson is saying that the difference between anti-colonization and decolonization is you've pulled yourself out of the mud, you're still covered in mud, you're out of the mud, but you're still, the remnants of it are still there. Then you wash all the mud off and liberate yourself into your true. So it's like you find a nice stone of some sort, but it's covered in mud and dirt and stuff, and then you need to remove that stone. And then you clean it up and you make it into a pretty crystal and you put it into a rock tumbler for a couple weeks. And then the stone gets to its true pretty form. I'm picking up what you're putting down, Ketson. I really am.
It's about changing your mental attitudes. And it does feel often like these conversations are seen as one or the other. And there isn't enough work on connecting the foundations in the political economy of the capitalist world order to and how that affects our psychic states. But there's also a kind of strange thing about time there, where it seems like conversations about racism and imperialism today are had as if we're really living in a post-racist, post-imperialist world, so that the European Parliament can declare that Black Lives Matter and can express its horror, presumably, at a past which was so racist. And this is really kind of disorienting, because it's the same European Parliament that is drowning thousands of people in the Mediterranean because they're racially locked out of nation states, and signing neo-colonial deals with Libya to send migrants to slave labor camps, and signing deals with settler colonial apartheid state in Palestine, which slaughters an indigenous population. So there's also this kind of weird sort of temporal experience where you sort of expect that either the world is racist and says so, or we're making serious progress in overcoming racism, and then we can work out what to do with the statues from a racist past. But instead, it feels
hang on. Kansas Mama, the left seems to be all about changing the way people group think and not pushing for individual think. That's because leftists are collectivists. This is a kind of like fundamental thing that I should probably work this into the How to Speak Socialist webinar, but it's like I just didn't for whatever reason. In order to understand the far left, one of the things that you must understand is that the left are collectivists. They want everyone to think in terms of the group. The right and people who are like libertarians like me, we like, if you believe in the individual, it's not even just like leftists to be like, or excuse me, it's not just people on the right. If you believe in individualism, if you believe that you should be able to think for yourself, if you believe that you should be able to say no to the group, that is the opposite of what the left believes. The left believes in assimilation into the Borg. They believe that everyone should consider the needs of the group above their own individual needs. That's the difference between collectivism and individualism.
There's a racist present, and the discourse is as if racism's a shadow and a legacy and is something that belongs in the past. And that's true of colonialism and imperialism as well, right? There's a kind of strange temporal lag where people want to talk as if something that's happening in the present is a problem of the past. So you have to clean up your attitude. It's like we can focus on the microaggressions now because the macroaggressions are gone, but they're both still there, really.
Yeah, I think just a brief comment on that is just, I think that you're spot on there, Barnaby. And I think it's kind of, I think a thing that I've come across a lot of times, like even in kind of leftist spaces, mentioning the word imperialism, and it kind of being basically assumed that it's the historical kind of event of imperialism. That's something that was there in the past, but that no longer exists. And I think
Chad, let me know what you think of this, Ketson, and Rottweiler too, and anyone else too, but those are the two that I'm going to look to for the moment. Chad says, people can be anti-colonialist, yet still think in capitalist terms and ideas, like the gender binary. For instance, you can be like an let me put this in like socialist language. You can be an anti-capitalist and think that capitalism is bad, but you might still think in terms like the gender binary, like supporting the nuclear family, stuff like that. Whereas decolonization is reversing those not even reversing them, removing the capitalist thoughts from your psyche. Like it's like queering your thoughts. It's like you no longer think in terms of like these norms that have developed as a result of capitalism. Remember, the socialists believe that capitalism created the gender binary, which created the nuclear family, which upholds capitalism through social reproduction theory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you were decolonized, though, the idea of the gender binary wouldn't even be a remnant in your brain. It would be like maybe in a museum somewhere, and like you go into the museum and you're like, did you know there used to be a time when people thought about men? Of course, it wouldn't be in a museum, because in a decolonized society, those ideas wouldn't even be discussed. They would be left to the ethers of history. I think that's a really great way to put it, Chad. Well done. And then Ketson says, like Nigeria can be created by a process of anti-colonialism, but it's still a capitalist nation state. It needs to be decolonized to remove capitalist norms. So yes, queering. Look at that. Ketson, welcome to the community. We appreciate you. Rottweiler, exactly. If we see decolonization is as liberation from capitalism, yes, the statement holds true. Exactly. Well done, guys. We got there with a definition. Great job.
I can kind of see that in kind of a lack of interest in kind of the political economy kind of literature that deals directly with imperialism, which is kind of, which there's quite a lot of, but I think there seems to be very little interest in that literature, which is kind of building on Marx. but taking it basically through Lenin and then taking it also through Amin, and kind of the critiques of these various articulations of kind of like a Marxian political economic critique of imperialism. And I think there's that's an interesting tradition that I think has received much too little attention, I think, to this day. I think, Annie, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, definitely. So it just kind of struck me. I think that there's a way in which we are pushed by contemporary discourse, and I think you're pushing back against this, Kevin, to think about, on the one hand, there being this old school Marxist tradition, Marxist-Leninism, of anti-colonialism, which only really cares about the serious questions of political economy. And on the other hand, are people who understand that it's much more complex than that, and then we have to think about the mind and culture, etc. And I think we run a risk of rewriting history, right?
She just said it. She just said it. This is decolonization is about, here's what it is. Like, decolonization is about getting into the mind and the culture. Whereas, like, anti-colonization is about, like, the political economy. It's about, like, capitalism and capitalism in general, being an anti-capitalist, like, whatever. Decolonization is about getting into the mind and the culture.
Because many of these revolutionary movements are centrally concerned with the question of culture, centrally concerned with the question of both moving as a society to transform social conditions, but understanding that the transformation of those social conditions and social relations are a necessary prerequisite to the kind of decolonization of the mind that we speak about today, right?
And so holy shit, fucking bot. Decolonization is about making people queer. It is. God damn it, it is. Would you guys agree with this based on our current thought process? Decolonization is about making people queer, about queering the mind, about queering. It is literally about making people queer. Fuck. All of this stuff eventually comes around and links together. Like their thinking is like very, very like circular, right? The definition of everything is making people queer. That's it. God damn it. Well, yes, making people comrades. Yes, they are even using queering as a term referring to their historical correction idea. Prometheus says many critical theorists have stated they want to not focus so much on economic Marxism and more on cultural Marxism. Yeah, we can all go home now. We're done. No, we're not done yet. We're going to listen a little while
more. I do
more.
think there's a way in which the left has allowed itself, in essence, to be pigeonholed or to be cut off from, shunted off from such a rich and complex history, right? It was the if you think about the Pan-African Cultural Festival, if you think about the language which said that, you know, culture is a weapon, right? Understanding that the mental well-being of a people is centrally important. It's also the kind of same revolutionary politics which produced an understanding of revolution as a politics of love, right? And today that all seems hollow, but that's because the concept of love that we have, the concept of mental well-being that we have is so hollowed out of any kind of material.
I would not argue that queer is about hyper-individualism. I would argue that queer is about destabilizing the system, destabilizing societal norms, going against the norm. Now, like, people might dye their hair different colors and wear crazy clothes and do crazy things, but like all queer people have a couple things in common. Number one, they don't like capitalism because it's a far left political ideology. Number two, they reject the gender binary, which is a creation of capitalism. Yeah, so I'm not sure I would say it's hyper. Just because they all have different color hair doesn't mean it's like necessarily about individualism, because all of the crazy shit that queer people do is ultimately about being part of the queer community. It's all to assimilate themselves to the norms within the queer community, which are directly contradictory to like capitalism and the norms of society that capitalism has allegedly created. Oh yeah, they want to queer everyone. They want everyone to be non-binary. That's what they mean when they say abolish the gender binary. They want everyone to be non-binary. They want us to transcend gender, transform gender as a way of getting rid of capitalism.
Material content because of neoliberalism. And I think that, tying to what Barnaby said, I do think it's important to not take the question of decolonization on its own, right? It's just one of many threads of how neoliberalism has managed to completely de-link language from meaning. To use the term used in your essay. But Barnaby gives the example of anti-racist politics and the question of race. And I think this kind of ties really neatly to one of the other questions I wanted to ask you about how, in a sense, I sense that the language of decolonization and decoloniality, in terms not just of its fetish of the mind, but also the fetish of Europe, right, which is central to it, and the rejection of both modernity and Eurocentricity, works in a way to essentially continue to breathe life into the same, hollow constructs which are given to us or offered to us by the period of colonization and its continuation and afterlives, insofar as something which is not dead can have an afterlife. And so I'm really interested in how there's another dynamic going on in the post-colonial world, in which the project of national liberation is in essence a project of class compromise, right? And the achievement of the independent nation state is the realization of the aspirations of the national bourgeoisie, right? And so long as we continue to draw the line of demarcation when it comes to questions of colonization and imperialism along the lines of countries which are colonized and countries which colonize, rather than peoples who are colonized and peoples who colonize. And I'm thinking here of the kind of 60s argument of the Black ghetto as the internal colony, and thinking about working class areas essentially as internal colonies, right? What we end up doing is allowing the work of colonization or of being colonized to do the abstracting work of essentially shielding a group of national bourgeoisies who are very happy to profit from the continued experience of neocolonialism and imperialism. I wondered what you thought about that.
I think that's totally correct. And I think there's something that I think what I'm very interested in doing as well, and this is in another essay that I've recently written that's coming out soon, but it's kind of basically trying to get into more detail into that process of basically how that national bourgeoisie captures power in the process of national liberation, and kind of the factional infighting that takes place, for instance, because that is a process. It's not, I think that's what I was saying earlier, it's not at that particular moment of decolonization, it's not a done deal which is going to win out, or which basically there's other articulations that are not the national bourgeoisie's articulation of what it means to basically free oneself from these colonial structures.
Hang on, guys, I think Twitter is just down. Twitter is just down. It's down for me too. Tayton's getting, Twitter is just down. Like, everyone relax. We're all going to survive. It's going to be fine.
I was looking at the process in Kenya, and I was looking at the process in Mozambique, for example.
I think it's already
but
back.
Also in Tanzania. And it's kind of, even if you have the project of decolonization, that kind of becomes a very stale kind of project, like in Tanzania, for example. Kind of remembering that there was a communist alternative even at that point in time, that was the Zanzibari Communist Party, which was pushing for an entirely different program of national liberation, which both of these are encompassed in the same kind of category of national.
Hang on, not about the stream. I gotta show you guys, this is fucking hilarious. I feel like Nick Fuentes is flirting with me on Twitter. And the reason that I say that Nick Fuentes is flirting with me on Twitter, hang on. Hey God, my Twitter's working. Ah, fuck. There it is. Hang on. Let me show you this. I posted my picture of the band knitting shawl yesterday. Fucking Nick Fuentes likes the band knitting shawl. This is great. This is great. I have Sophie Lewis from the far left who totally has a crush on me, and I have Nick Fuentes on the far right who I'm pretty sure is flirting with me on Twitter. This is great, guys. This is fucking great. Let's not say that I still don't have it. I love this. What a time to be alive. I swear to God. I'm gonna post this on Instagram and really piss off all the woke knitters. Yes, I am bringing everyone together. I am bringing the alt-right fascists together with the abolish the family socialists, all through the power of knitting and Twitter. All right, let's get back to being serious. Sorry, knitting break. National
liberation tradition, but one of them is like distinctly Marxist and the other one, for example, is not. So I think it's kind of there's something about disentangling also those two kind of strands of thinking about national liberation in the process of decolonization, because I think Yanni, on the one hand you're right, is the national bourgeoisie won out, and that's the program of kind of when we speak about colonized countries or whatever, and we kind of basically speak about, we kind of lean into the project of these national bourgeoisies. But I think it's kind of, thinking about national liberation as this project where there was two different currents or multiple different currents at the height of kind of decolonization. The national bourgeoisie being one of those. And I think more radical programs being articulated by other parties and groups. So I think it's well worth, I think part of the thing that I'm also doing with the long essay is trying to push in a direction of kind of trying to understand those a little bit more, those kind of alternatives that existed at that point, and those kind of formations that were basically fighting against what was then the outcome of national liberation, which is kind of this reinforcement of the nation state. So I think it's definitely worth revisiting those. And I think also what Annie was saying, when we kind of think about the question of particularly the social revolution in kind of the national liberation process, and kind of, if we have the kind of project of the national bourgeoisies, that social revolution doesn't really take place. But then kind of, we have this in Mozambique, for example, with Frelimo, kind of when you look at the liberated zones right before kind of they gained an independent state, and then you kind of have this process of the social revolution taking place in these liberated zones. But then through other processes of political assassinations and kind of other interventions, it becomes basically...
Hang on, we have a very important question about my hair. Serious question, are you growing your hair out for an undercover op? I did like your super sassy, asymmetrical cut, kind of rockabilly. No, I'm growing my hair out because my husband asked me to grow it out. And my husband has never seen me with long hair in the entire time that we've been married. And because even when we got married, I had it short in the back, and then it kind of came to I had it really short in the back, and then I cut it all off. And so he's never seen me with long hair. And so I started growing it out because I got lazy and I didn't want to go get it cut during the pandemic. And then it just kept growing. And I was like, maybe I'll grow my hair out. But I do still wear it in I'm just not wearing it in the asymmetrical cut now, but I can still style it in the asymmetrical cut. And so, after 12 years of marriage, almost, it'll be 12 years on November 5th. I thought I would throw my husband a bone and let him see me with long hair. It's all. Got to keep the romance alive at some point. That's all I'm saying.
Impossible to continue this kind of process of the social revolution. And what we end up with is basically just a subservient state over the longer period of time, which kind of is what the Frelimo government in Mozambique is at the moment.
I have a question about this, if I can jump in, which is at the end of the essay, you raise the example of Eduardo Mondlane, one of the founders of Frelimo in Mozambique, and talk about John Saul, the great academic in solidarity with. I think he actually went to teach in Mozambique. I mean,
I think he was here for a very long time there.
And he and Saul sort of giving Mondlane as an example of kind of heroic intellectual and leader of that anti-colonial struggle. Samora Machel, also the first independent president of Mozambique, there's a speech where he, after the victory, repeats the anti-colonial slogan, "A luta continua," the struggle continues, after they've beaten the Portuguese, and then says "contra que," against what? And says against illiteracy, against tribalism, against. There's a very, very clear sense, obviously, in the Marxism-Leninism of Frelimo's anti-colonialism, that it's a social revolution as well. So then there's a question about whether we think of the tragedies and the defeats and the difficulties of those kinds of projects as being problems of their moment and of the external challenges and impositions they faced. So the anti-colonial project in Mozambique suddenly won, and because there's a coup and a revolution in Portugal, but then the apartheid state in South Africa, of course, supports a wrecking force to destroy the country. So is it, is it apartheid that makes Mozambique into a dictatorship? Or do we talk about, because if we're doing the work now of revisiting these earlier horizons, which you're saying we've lost touch with in mainstream anti-racist decolonizing politics today, because we've dismissed them all as well. They were invested in the nation form, so they were actually colonial as well. And actually you're saying, and people like Adam Getachew and Frederick Cooper and Gary Wilder are saying, actually, there were much more debates that don't lump in with Eurocentricity. So if we're trying to return to the richness of those mid-20th century debates, do we return to them and face their problems by saying we can account for most or all of their problems because of the huge challenges they faced, whether in the political wars of their colonial enemies or in the economic problems of a world capitalist system that they were ill. I don't know if we can hear.
Oh, sorry, I didn't catch that last part.
But just I just want to say, do we think of this as, do we think of the problems they faced as external political and economic challenges? They had a developed language right from Kwame Nkrumah's essay about neocolonialism. They had a developed language in anti-colonial struggles about the difficulties of achieving supposed sovereignty as an independent state when you exist in a capitalist world order that you as an independent state alone can't fight. It's a debate going right back to the Haitian Revolution and C.L.R. James's classic reading of the problem of the Haitian Revolution. You're free, supposedly, but you're still a tiny island, so you send people back to work on plantations. What else can you do? Is that a tragedy in which there's no other option? Or do we want to think critically about the ideas, the politics of those moments, of those anti-colonial struggles that we want to venerate, and think that there were better options not pursued? How do we see that balance between problems of the moment and problems of the ideas?
I think that's it's such a difficult one to
I think that's right,
because,
John.
Of course, it's not only just the external circumstances, because there's other things happening at that political and historical moment. So it's not just the kind of thing of, oh, it's impossible considering these revisiting revisiting these traditions is not, the point of revisiting them is not to basically say that there was no other option given the external circumstances that were basically that were in place, and there's nothing else that could have been done. I think it's actually trying to revisit them historically, and I think for me it's more just it's trying to put those ideas into context, but I think it's looking at what those figures were writing, or those kind of revolutionaries were writing at the time and saying at the time, in response to this kind of seeming inevitability that their revolution would be crushed. So it's their articulations of these different options that they have. So I think there is something worth revisiting there. That's not solely about just saying that this process basically was stopped by external forces or whatever. So I think, is that what you were getting at, Barnaby? I don't know if I understood you right.
Yeah, I think the question I'm trying to pose is how we tell a story about the 20th century and before it that balances a sense of the enormous obstacles that anti-colonial revolutionary processes face with a sense of some of the politics of those processes that we would want to do differently. Whether that's, as Annie was saying, national independence as a project of class compromise, and the difficulty of a properly socially revolutionary process in forming new nation states in which you need some kind of
a properly socially revolutionary process. I just wanted to point out that word choice.
Accommodation with a local bourgeoisie, or whether it's thinking through problems of dictatorship and autocracy and trying to work out the degree to which that's a necessary step because you're surrounded by external enemies, which can easily become a kind of apologetic language of tyranny, and how we want a democratic politics of liberation, which is a problem for socialist politics and a problem for anti-colonial politics. So it's about how we do the balance between an awareness of the obstacles and not being aware of them is kind of classic, CIA move to denigrate people.
No, of course, and I think
neither want to fall into the CIA thing nor the Stalinist position of it's all external enemies and that's why I've got to send you to the gulag. So how we tell that tension in the anti-colonial case.
Yeah, and I think that's like, I mean, it's one of the things that I wish I could answer for you very clearly, but I can't. I think it's kind of thinking about also that process of just how do we kind of salvage kind of the democratic elements of this particular process of national liberation, which is like, I think for me, a very, very, very crucial question is just kind of like, okay, looking at the social revolution and kind of like, what are the particular kind of articulations of democratic programs that are implemented in this kind of process. But I think it's kind of, so it's looking at, for example, again, I think it's just because I find it's a very useful example of Mozambique and just kind of basically kind of having democratic experimentation in these liberated zones that you're kind of pushing outwards and outwards, but you still kind of capture the state. So it's kind of, it's the tension between those two processes, I think. That's particularly interesting for me. It's the kind of the articulation of like a certain type of radical democratic kind of impulse during the liberation war, but the liberation war being having to kind of face up to basically creating this independent nation state. So I think these are the tensions that I'm trying to think through in this essay, for example, but I think that require more than an essay to think through, because they're very, 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 very difficult questions that I think are kind of the challenge of that process of, I think when we talk about decolonization, that's kind of the process. Or when we talk about decolonial, that's kind of what we should be talking about. And I think what I'm trying to do is animate that conversation.
Hey guys, I want to see if anyone objects to this. Can I fast forward to the Q&A part? Because I feel like we've kind of used the discussion they have already to really nail down what they mean by decolonialization and anti-colonialization. I feel like we've actually, for as rough as this may have started, and I feel like for as rough as this has started a little bit with me getting a little uppity and upset about being frustrated with everything, I think we actually got there. I think we got what we needed. I want to go to the Q&A part, which I think is usually about an hour, because I think that they're just going to keep rehashing it. And Q&A is always where they say the quiet part out loud. Okay, Annie is back. Maybe that means they've started Q&A.
We've not yet worked out how to relate to the history of the national liberation movements, as you mentioned. And I think part of that...
No, not yet. Hang on, they're still talking. Q&A. Where will we find Q&A?
Alternatives at the time of independence. And what could have...
Not there, we won't.
The most inspirational aspects of the national liberation moment for me was...
No, not Q&A, not Q&A. I don't know exactly when it starts.
Well, it basically argues for a delinking of state and nation, but it says the nation is the bad thing and the state is, we can just have a reconfigured citizenship and kind of make the state work in a different way. So it's kind of pointing towards the nation as being the problem in that configuration of the nation state. But I think there's an interesting debate going on that I think I have yet to fully resolve for myself between...
No. Q&A, get to Q&A, please.
About
Q&A.
Exactly the right.
Excellent.
A few questions in the chat about this. So Annie raised Steve's question, which I thought was a good question about, I think exactly the right question. What would national liberation, what would it mean to have an anti-colonial project that didn't reduce itself to separate nation forms in a system of world capitalism? The most you could hope for would be one single global nation state that was still a state whose job was to manage a thing called an economy and whose job was to manage class relations, even if it was much bigger and extended across, well, it didn't have borders. And then there's another question from, I think, Benjamin, who asks, okay, if national states are no good? Is the alternative a plurinational republican framework? Is the alternative federation?
Is she
Well,
breastfeeding?
Gary Wilder has that book about.
Is she breastfeeding on the live stream? Wow. Okay. I mean, like, you know, it's a thing, I guess. I'm not like it just seems a little odd to me to be breastfeeding on a fucking live stream.
About the federation as an alternative to nation. But I think what you're getting at has really much broader relevance for the whole discussion about problems in different ways of constructing decolonization, which is that the problem of the nation state for anti-colonial revolutionaries wasn't just the problem of nation, borders, pitting people against each other on the basis of where they're born, perhaps, but also the problem of state, because it was the anti-colonial politics was a politics of self-determination, which wanted people to have power over their lives, and therefore was opposed to colonialism as a form of the alienation of that power. You know, Fanon as a humanist is concerned with the alienation of powers, and colonialism is obviously a massive case of the alienation of power from the colonized to the colonizer. And state apparatuses are also forms of the alienation of power, classically, famously, just as class relations.
You guys are really going to make me stream snipe this Midwestern Marx stream, aren't you? All right, fucking fine. All right, I'll make a goddamn fucking thumbnail. God fucking damn it. All right, fine.
The forms of the alienation of power. And so I think one of the things that you're trying to do in the essay that's important is to get back a sense of anti-colonial politics as a form of politics that is about empowerment, which ought to include today building on the achievements of the decolonial turn in terms of having an awareness that that alienation and disempowerment don't merely take the aggressive form of guns and bombs and state violence, but also might take the form of humiliations and degradations, apparently more subtle, but like being given books that tell you about history in which you never appear and never feature except as a savage other. And so being attentive, and it's not like decolonial studies the first people to be aware of those nominally more subtle forms of violence. Obviously, Fanon, for example, is highly relevant. James Baldwin writes very lyrically about them, which is one of the reasons I think he's going through a kind of revival of interest at the moment. But it seems to me like what you're trying to do is to forge a sense that a decolonial politics isn't just, well, an anti-colonial politics isn't just this easily boxed up question called race and empire, separate from other things, but is part of a broader politics of empowerment, which is why it's of interest.
God damn it, Barnaby.
Just let's see if we can get him back so we can finish the question.
Socialist internet ruins everything.
I feel like he was just getting to his point.
Well, this is what you get for being long-winded, okay?
I'm just kind of, because it would be difficult to kind of address the question without that last part of it.
Yes, it would be difficult to address the question without the full question. Oh my God!
Any by any chance?
That legitimately scared the hell out of me.
What Barnaby was saying there.
So I think okay, he's back.
There we go.
Sorry, I'm so sorry that you lost me. I was. Shall I go on, or were you?
You were talking about a politics of power.
You hear the last part of what you said.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that
it's politics of empowerment.
Yeah, it seemed to me that one of the things that you're trying to do in your essay, and one of the things that many of us are trying to do today, is to recover that lost 20th century sense that anti-colonial politics fit within a broader matrix, that the Black Power movement, for example, in Britain and America was developing alongside the women's liberation movement and alongside revived workers' struggles as one part of a politics of what Fanon called disalienation, of recovering powers that had been alienated from you to others, whether it's to oppressors or to an impersonal logic of capital accumulation. And that perhaps the aggressive particularism of the decolonial politics, in which it's like, this is a wrong that was done to some people and it's theirs to talk about and it's their lived experience, loses the glories of the sense in which the colonial experience stands in as something very universal, because it represents an alienation which people all over the world in all kinds of different forms can understand. and is therefore a kind of ground for solidarity, and that decolonizing the world is therefore about empowering people, including along all kinds of axes that aren't obviously about race or nation.
Decolonizing the world is about, let's just like think about that last bit that he said, because that's actually the important thing, I think. Hang on.
Presents an alienation which people all over the world in all kinds of different forms can understand. And is therefore a kind of ground for solidarity, and that decolonizing the world is therefore about empowering people, including along all kinds of axes that aren't obviously about race or nation or empire.
Decolonizing the world is about empowering people. What do you guys think that socialists mean when they say decolonizing the world is about empowering people? What do they mean by that? Destroying capitalism, because capitalism is inherently oppressive. And so to liberate people from the oppressive force that is keeping them down, the only way to empower people is by just getting rid of capitalism. Equity is another way we're going to say getting rid of capitalism, because you can't have a society built on equity without getting rid of capitalism, freeing them from capitalism, liberating them from capitalism, freeing them from capitalism. Thank you. You know what you're talking about.
And am I right that that's one thing that you're trying to recover, is not just universalism of beyond the language of lived experience into a language of what we have in common, but the universalism of a desire for empowerment?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's kind of, so that's also partly what I find in some indigenous studies critiques of decolonial studies is kind of, it rejects kind of this very particular kind of boxing off as it's only these people can speak about these experiences kind of approach, and kind of trying to build broader solidarities against basically imperialism and settler colonialism, while acknowledging, for example, that settler colonialism is a different context than what we might call, or the continued settler colonialism is a different context to what we might call neocolonialism, and those being particular projects, but that there is kind of a sense that there's a common shared solidarity in those particular struggles. And I think I found Nick Estes' work really helpful in kind of bridging, which I also kind of mentioned towards the end of the essay, in kind of bridging, for example, those two conversations between kind of indigenous studies and the anti-colonial tradition, and kind of giving these examples of, like, for instance, the 1977 delegation of elders from different indigenous nations that went to the UN basically to articulate their claims for nationhood in this international, basically, family of nations, and the support that was given by different national liberation movements and other kind of these other movements, and that it's kind of like that it is a question of solidarity there between those different struggles, and that sometimes that kind of solidarity is necessary to kind of achieve any type of, even if they're small successes or large successes, but that solidarity is very, very necessary to achieve these things. And I think it's kind of thinking about, and I think sometimes I do think about indigenous studies in relation to decolonial studies as indigenous studies being more aware of kind of linking themselves to these broader kind of embedding itself in these broader solidarities, whereas kind of I think sometimes the decolonial studies school tries to bracket itself off instead of basically reaching outwards. So I think that's one of the big kind of problems of that particular discourse, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense, and it's very much along the same lines that I was thinking. A question from the chat, and then I have another before we say goodbye. But a question from the chat is people asking your thoughts on the land back movement.
Just in terms of, are there any specifics or just?
No, I mean, I suspect people are interested in terms of this conversation being quite Western-centric in talking about the turn from an anti-colonial politics of the colonization of land into a decolonial politics of university syllabi and statues. But of course, in South Africa, there's still a very live question about land. And what do you think of the language to which that is that a form of the old anti-colonial politics, the current land back movement, or is that something very different?
I mean, it depends in what context we're talking about the return of land, right? Whether we're talking about it in North America, in these different settler colonial contexts. And I think, because, if we speak about it in North America, for example, we then have to think also always about kind of indigenous people's relationship to the land and how that's related to nationhood and freedom and these kinds of questions. But I think, I don't know if I would want to make a broader claim about like all settler colonies and land back movements in all of those. But I think it's just, I think it's kind of a question that we've, in our conversations, kind of like, swerved around. And but I think it's also just because I think it's, for me, that's not.
Ketson, you need to come back and join our streams more often, especially Socialism Saturday. I think I would really appreciate your input, but I like the way you put this. I haven't thought about this way before. Intersectionality is a way of talking about the multiplicity of ways that people are not queered. Interesting. I haven't watched Jimmy Dore in a while. I like what I've seen. I just don't watch a lot of other content creators. But I'm not offended by him. He's not like the Young Turks or anything.
Not necessarily my particular area of expertise, so I don't really want to make big judgments on it, if that makes sense.
That makes total sense.
Also, I mean, it's feel free to chip in, Annie, Barnaby.
Annie, you're back with us.
That's part of the point, Aaron.
There were. Did you hear the question? Did you catch the question, Annie? Oh, I don't know if you are with us in terms of sound.
Oh my God, these people.
So Annie says she didn't hear. So people in the chat were asking, and someone has just framed it in terms of me and Kevin both talking about the potential universal solidarities of empowerment that anti-colonial struggle represents. And people have asked about questions of land, those classic questions of colonization and the land back movement. And someone then saying, okay, so how universal can we really talk about the colonial language being if like some people have the land and others don't? And Kevin,
how anti-colonial can we be talking about if some people have the land and other people don't? What that means is that some people own the private property and have access to the private property and that other people don't. Do you guys see that?
And just raised this point about the difficulty of talking about land back in the American case, and sometimes the difficulty of trying to reverse histories. And I know Annie has thoughts about this. And the difficulty of making
this is why they have land blessings
history, rather than about
because property.
Hang on. So
this is why they're so big on land blessings, because land blessings are an indication that property was taken away from like the rightful inhabitants of the land.
Do you think about debates around? There's debate in North America about indigenous peoples. There's debates in South Africa about the return of land. And Kevin was asking your thoughts on that, Annie.
Yeah. Okay, so two things. I think firstly on the question of language, I think the two are kind of, my responses to the two are structured by one dichotomy in my mind, is the resistance to colonialism or coloniality centered on a return to some pure history? Or
yes.
is it centered on
groups own the land? The comrades own the land.
Those scraps being some form of abundance, right? Or reorganizing society such that everybody is able to live the best possible standard of living, right? And I think there is a sense in which I don't know if this is an easy comparison, but I think about earlier on we had on the screen the image of the Benin bronzes. And I think about how much of...
Hang on. Janet, you're not thinking like a socialist, you're thinking like a bourgeois. Janet says, how do they determine the rightful inhabitants when land swaps ownership over the years? Because they think that land should be owned by the collective. The collective. They don't believe in private property ownership, and so they don't like recognize the legitimacy of someone selling land to another person or giving it to another person, or anything that takes ownership out of the collective is not something they acknowledge as legitimate. Does that make sense? Like, you're thinking about it like as a normal person does, but you're not thinking about it like the socialist would think about it.
The discussion contemporarily around land, around artifacts, are centered on whether intentional or unintentional the economic potential or the potential for commodification, right? And who ought to have a right to that commodification or the proceeds of that commodification. And so I think that firstly, when we think about resistance to colonialism, we think about anti-imperialism, we think about what liberation might look like. I think to an extent where everyone spoke about.
I bet you she's thinking about abolishing the family right this second.
Okay. I'm sorry. Earlier on, Barnaby was speaking about essentially who are the heirs of revolution, right? And what does solidarity mean? It means that everybody ought to share in that. And I do think that there is a way in which we find ourselves or land ourselves back in particularism, land ourselves back in the space where...
The webinar is decolonized.
We're doing all the important work. Wow.
Yeah, just maybe I don't know if that builds on it in any way, but I think so there's kind of, I think there's a small part that I have in the essay on the essay decolonization is not a metaphor. And I think it's kind of, because I think I agree with that essay to a certain point, and I think at one point it tries to sever kind of the ties between itself and its own position. Basically tries to make like a very sharp distinction between kind of the land back arguments and broader anti-colonial struggles. And I think it's kind of right to be careful of subsuming kind of that particular problematic within the context of just broader anti-imperialist conversations. But I think it's not helpful to kind of make basically a separation and try to distance oneself from that other kind of anti-colonial or anti-imperialist project. And I think it's kind of, Nick Estes does this again, kind of like an interesting thing of comparing, for example, and which also relates to something Annie was just saying, kind of trying to bring together the indigenous activist Russell Means and Amilcar Cabral and kind of like their conception of culture as like not this kind of static.
Hang on. Tolkien fan is asking if it wants to display. So am I correct in my assumption? If they don't believe in private property, they also don't believe borders between countries should exist. Ding, 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 ding. You are correct, sir. They do not believe borders between countries should exist.
Kind of archaic thing that is from the past and doesn't really move and doesn't really develop or whatever. But it's kind of seeing those elements of cultures that have survived kind of the process of colonization, and that being the kind of thing that one is concerned with preserving or that one wants to build on, and not necessarily the process of going back and finding this kind of pure kind of moment. Yeah, but I think, yeah. Okay, so
they're like telling him, wrap up, bro.
Hello. So this has been fantastic, and
all right.
We have been dealing.
All right. I think that's about all we're going to get from that. That's basically the end of it. But I think, guys, like, there's a couple important things I want to point out. Number one, I know that we skipped around a little bit, but like, I just really want everyone to be like, really to put a fine point on this. In a webinar about the idea of decolonization, which was only meant for like socialist activists to watch. They didn't talk about violence once. Did anyone notice that? They didn't talk about violence once not because they don't believe in it. Again, I'm not suggesting that socialists are passive, because they are not pacifists, okay? But because their preference for how to go about decolonizing things, which is to wipe the ideas related to capitalism and private property completely from the human consciousness, is I think what we landed on, right? The way they want to go about that is by changing culture, changing society, architecting things in a certain way, getting rid of things that don't serve their end goals. But they're not going to use violence as like a starting point. I think they would use violence as like a last resort, because they don't need to use violence to get their ways. Now, they might use violence to like destabilize the system. Don't get it twisted. They're not above using violence and looting and crime and all of this stuff to destabilize the system. They do that all the time, right? We're seeing them do that in major American cities right now. But in terms of the decolonization aspects or the anti-colonization aspects, which anti-colonization, I think we've decided, will lead to decolonization aspects. They're not suggesting using violence to go that way. Okay? So that's why I wanted to have this stream. I wanted to show you guys, and I didn't watch this beforehand. I had no idea about the massive amounts of technical issues they were going to have or anything. Well, no, Antifa's not a small faction. Like, every far left socialist considers themselves to be an anti-fascist. Now, whether or not they're actually part of Black Bloc is like another thing. Not everyone who considers themselves to be an anti-fascist is like going to go out and do like, you know, hand-to-hand combat training and go to protest all dressed in black with umbrellas and stuff like that. Antifa are the agitators, like BLM are the agitators. But this is all around destabilizing the system so they can cause problems. They can blame capitalism on those problems, and they can use that to usher in their Marxist utopia. But every far left socialist is going to consider themselves to be an anti-fascist in general, for sure. All right. Do they use the terrorists to do the dirty work and hope they come back? Well, okay, so first of all, I don't want to call them terrorists, and it's not because I don't like, I understand why you did. I just want to be really precise and specific about language. You know, it's funny, everyday therapist. I was just thinking that we should read Rules for Radicals again, to be honest. We read it a while ago. I think it might do us well to read it again. But like they use the agitators, the actual Antifa activists, the actual Black Lives Matter activists. They use agitators and protests and fiery but mostly peaceful things and sieging the White House and all this stuff. They use that to destabilize things, to create problems in the world so that they can blame those problems on capitalism. Is this part of open society? Different groups. Different groups. Different groups. My understanding is it's different groups. So no, not directly. No. All right, guys. Well, apparently I have to stream snipe something tonight. So I'm going to take a little bit of a break. And then in a little less than an hour, maybe about 45, 50 minutes or so, we're going to come back and we are going to stream snipe the shit out of Midwestern Marx. And Midwestern Marx is having a live stream in about an hour, and it's called Gaza Resists, a Zionist Extermination Campaign. And the description is, what are the latest developments in the war on Palestine? Did Saturday's events give Netanyahu and the genocidaries a carte blanche to flatten and disappear Gaza? How can we most effectively stand with our Palestinian sisters and brothers under siege from a colonial Israel with full U.S. backing? Join Nancy Mansour, the founder of Existence is Resistance, to address the urgent questions, and join a march across this country and stand with true, anonymous global heroes of Palestine. That'll be fun. That'll be fun. All right, Ketson, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. Please come back sometime. But I'm going to go take a little bit of a break, guys, and we will stream snipe the shit out of Midwestern Marx in about 45 minutes. All right, guys, take care. We'll see you soon. Go get a dinner and some drinks. We're going to need them. Bye.